Hello, this lecture is on the Loyalists. The American Revolution ushered in the birth of the United States, but it was a civil war that split the American people. The episode also transformed Canada. The American victory over the British generated a mass migration to Canada of Americans loyal to the King. British North American society witnessed many changes as over 50,000 Americans settled in their new land. It was an emotional trial. One young Loyalist mother wrote of the heavy burden of her first day in Eastern Canada. As the ships disappeared in the distance, a feeling of loneliness came over me that, though I had not shed a tear through all the war, I sat down on the damp moss with my baby on my laps and cried bitterly. With the experience of exile and the uncertainty of their prospects in their minds, the Loyalists forged a new life in a hinterland. There were three categories of Americans in the Revolution. 1/3 were patriots, 1/3 were Tory loyalists, and the rest of the population were willing to go along with either the patriots or loyalists. The loyalists were conservative in nature, whereas the patriots were typically more brash. Many loyalists kept quiet and did not reveal their position. Americans calling themselves loyalists or the King's friends could not support the War of Independence. They favored British tradition and stability and saw the forces of independence as representing disorder and anarchy. Most loyalists cherished living in America before the Revolution, but they could not accept a new government based on Republican ideas. To American patriots, the Loyalists were nothing less than traitors. Many Loyalists were put in jail, some were stripped naked, beaten, coated with hot tar, sprinkled with feathers, and then forced roughly through the streets. There were a few executions. Such treatment and other types of persecution had taken place as early as 1774. Ill treatment occurred on both sides. In areas where Loyalists had the upper hand, supporters of the revolution were treated poorly. The Loyalist numbers were stronger in New York, which had a major British base, but weaker in colonies such as Rhode Island. Larger colonies by population typically had the strongest support for the King. Relying on British naval strength against Spain, many in Florida sided with the British. Recent immigrants from European countries tended to support the British, as did many Indians who feared the westward movement of Americans. The War of Independence split many families, some severed forever. One well-known family that experienced bitter separation was the family of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin played a major role in the cause for American independence, but his son, William Franklin, stayed loyal to the King. Father left nothing for son. Benjamin Franklin's will stated, quote, "The party acted against me in the late war, which is public notoriety, will account for me leaving him no more of an estate he endeavored to deprive me of," end of quote. Historian Paul Johnson argues that religion was a significant factor in the split. Many Anglicans were loyalists. Representative of the Anglican Loyalists were Jonathan Boucher of Maryland, who delivered a sermon in 1775 entitled "On Civil Liberty, Passive Obedience, and Non-Resistance." Paul Johnson writes that the English church and state lost the political and military battle because they had already lost the religious battle. The Loyalists suffered a great deal by remaining loyal to the British cause. They lost their homes, lands, and careers. They left behind working farms, successful businesses, and long ties to the community. When the British Army pulled out, approximately 100,000 Loyalists left for Britain, the West Indies, and Canada. Many of those who went to England, having lost all, were bitter that the British government did not honor Loyalist claims for compensation. They had to be loyal to the state, but they had been loyal to the state, but the British government treated many of them poorly. Over half of the 100,000 Loyalists immigrated to Nova Scotia and Quebec. Approximate numbers were 35,000 to Nova Scotia and 17,000 to Quebec. In one fell swoop, the 35,000 Loyalists tripled the population of Nova Scotia. In 1784, the western part of Nova Scotia became the colony of New Brunswick, where 15,000 of the 35,000 settled. As many as 6,000 Blacks migrated to the Nova Scotia. Unfortunately, these Blacks did not receive equal treatment. Most Loyalists overall favored Nova Scotia because its fisheries, land, and potential trade were attractive. The voyage from New York to Nova Scotia took from 1 to 2 weeks. The Loyalists faced an uncertain future in a land where the forests still crowded the water's edge. The government was unprepared for the Loyalists, who gathered in temporary camps, short of food and supplies, waiting for the British to act on their promise to help them rebuild their lives. The 15,000 Loyalists who went to St. John and up the St. John River initially faced bleak prospects. Not only were there no shelters, but the land along the land had yet to be surveyed. It was this surge of Loyalists that resulted in the founding of New Brunswick, with Frederickstown named after the second son of George III, which was chosen as capital. What became the city of Fredericton was 65 miles up the St. John River, safer from possible American attacks. In addition to security, the other main reason for the location of the capital there was to encourage settlement in the interior of New Brunswick. One of the Loyalist families who settled in the Fredericton area was Philip Krause from North Carolina. He and his wife Sarah had a family of 16 children. The first New Brunswick governor was Colonel Thomas Carleton, the younger brother of Guy Carleton, governor of Quebec. Loyalists elsewhere in Nova Scotia faced challenging times. The first Loyalists called the colony Nova Scarcity. Those who chose Shelburne, for example, found out that the soil in the area was poor and inland communications deplorable. Its population did reach 10,000, but over the years it declined to less than 1,000 people. Approximately 1,000 settled on Cape Breton Island, which was a separate colony until 1820. In the early 1800s, Cape Breton Island grew with the arrival of Catholic Scots from the west coast of Scotland. Many Loyalists who found life too hard in Nova Scotia left the area for New Brunswick, Upper Canada, or went back to the United States. Several hundred Loyalists settled on Prince Edward Island, where they encountered the treachery and duplicity of crooked landowners. Promised lands for Loyalists never materialized. When Loyalists settled in Quebec, it became clear that the land system was inadequate. The settlers opposed the seigneurial land system. The government listened, and the Constitutional Act of 1791 abolished the seigneurial system and replaced it with a system of freehold tenure in important regions. The act was the third Quebec constitution in less than 30 years. The Constitutional Act of 1791 also divided Quebec into Lower Canada and Upper Canada, which disappointed the English in Lower Canada, who felt separated from the growing number of English in Upper Canada. Many of the Loyalists in Quebec settled in what were to become the eastern townships. The English-speaking population accounted for about 10% of the Quebec population, still a small minority, but much bigger than the early minuscule number of English. Further west and up the St. Lawrence River was a hinterland of no significant importance for the British. This changed. During the Revolutionary years, some Loyalists from Western New York had sought refuge in present-day Ontario. In 1784, many more Loyalists traveled to Quebec and then to soon-to-be-named Upper Canada. There were no roads, and they sailed up the St. Lawrence River on bulky, flat-bottomed boats that held 4 or 5 families. At rapids, everyone disembarked while the men hauled the boats by ropes over the rough water. The air was thick with flies and mosquitoes. At night, the travelers slept on the riverbank under the stars. In this period, the British signed treaties with Indians to provide land for the Loyalists. The British also purchased land from the Mississauga or Ojibwa to give to the loyal Iroquois who had sided with the British during the American Revolution. One of the first settlements in the area was Cataraqui. When the Loyalists arrived in Cataraqui, soldiers had already completed buildings to house themselves. Other construction included a hospital, bakehouse, wharf, sawmill, and flour mill. Once the Loyalists moved onto their land, the first task was to build a shelter, which was usually a primitive type of log cabin with 2 rooms without a cellar or foundation. The roof consisted of overlapping bark or small hollowed basswood logs. Some homes had chimneys built of stick and clay, others were without a chimney. The next task was to clear land to plant crops. No matter what their occupation was in the 13 colonies, most Loyalists were all farmers now. With the creation of Upper Canada, there was further drive for British colonization. The first Lieutenant Governor was John Simcoe, who had visions of turning Upper Canada into a Little England. Enticed with free land grants, a later wave of Loyalists settled in Upper Canada. Upper Canada was home to approximately 70,000 people by 1810, most of whom settled along the St. Lawrence and near Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and Lake St. Clair. To conclude, the American Revolution was a civil war that had a dramatic impact on Canada. Over 50,000 Americans, representing a rough cross-section of American colonial society, settled in this new northern land. Historian George Rawlick wrote that the Loyalists shared little in common except a sense of defeat and despair. However, the demands of harsh times hardened Loyalist families. Courageous and resourceful people did what was necessary to survive and flourish. Thank you.